Well, welcome to another episode of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We're going to wrestle a couple of issues today. One, I think when we all went through the Rogers tech meltdown, we realized how vulnerable we were. I know I, for one, was kind of surprised. How do we let this stuff happen when we're so fundamentally dependent on the technology, from everything from calling 911 to just our basic day-to-day communication and banking and all of those things. The second issue I want to get into with our guest is the whole question of regulation of the technology, regulation of the internet, which we do regularly on this program. But I really like to get Tim Denton's perspective. He is a former CRTC National Commissioner. He is a lawyer, where he says he describes his work as working at the intersection of law and technology. And he is also currently the chair of the Internet Society's Canadian chapter. And this is a group that monitors and follows and comments upon these issues regularly. So I know, Tim, you are very concerned about the government's attempt to regulate speech by regulating the internet. But I want to start, if I could, for a moment, just on what happened with Rogers. What should this be happening in 2022? What do we do when it does, when so much of our lives are tied up into this?
Well, first of all, it shouldn't be happening, and does, and accidents happen.
Right.
It's up to government, in a sense, to seek to mitigate the damage and to seek to mitigate the occurrence. Especially concerned with emergency services calling. Right. And the ability of public safety access points to return the calls and to know where you are and not to lose track of the call. And that's important enough. I think the other thing is basically we need to be very suspicious of any moves to replace cash. I don't like the idea of a currency that is dependent upon computers for its validity. And I think that's the conservative safety first approach would be to make sure you have a few $100 in your wallet. And
I've got to tell you that when I lived in New York after 9/11, and so we went into drills in the office all the time for what would happen, I always have cash. And there I was the other day, one of the lucky ones, when the Rogers system went down.
Yeah. I think that's important. I mean, it's a bit like having a wood stove when you've got gas heating or electrical heating. You've got a survival mode, which is impossible for a lot of people, given that they live in high rises. But anyway, I think the government should inquire. I think there should be a scientific and dispassionate inquiry, and it should be lessons to be learned. And I'm sure there will be some, but I seek to avoid the condemnation of Rogers or anybody involved for premature, because disasters happen, and it's really not a question of it's a question of resilience. It's a question of being able to come back from it. And I don't have enough knowledge now to say the government should do this, that, or the next thing, but it certainly should be doing what it is, which is inquiring carefully.
But one of the things government sort of suggested, and I mean, it seems sensical, if Rogers goes down, turn to Bell and say, help us out, or vice versa. But on the other hand, then that kind of doubles the load on that second carrier, whoever they are, and who knows what'll happen there.
Yeah, there's only so much infrastructure, and one has to be careful about imposing a 50% increase of load on a network, just as you would not wish to impose 50% increase of load on an electrical network all of a sudden. So I think they've got to start in smaller increments of getting 911 to work in this situation, and then see about a load sharing. But that's again, that's technical, scientific, and needs dispassionate inquiry.
Not a political declaration.
Not you and me making declarations.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that, because we really don't know what we're talking about.
You're getting to yes.
But one of the issues where we are both very up to speed on and very concerned about is something I just mentioned briefly, the government's ongoing attempt to regulate speech by regulating the internet and content thereon. So there are these two questions, like go and get the technology working. And government does have some role in that, so that me sitting in Saskatchewan can actually have a conversation with you, which we tried to do yesterday and didn't work out so well. So I would like somebody to work on that. But then I'm very concerned about what I see happening from 2 or 3 different pieces of government legislation. So you came through the CRTC process, and now the government wants the CRTC, which currently regulates CBC and CTV and the broadcasters that we know, but now they want to regulate us. I'm assuming you don't think that's a good idea.
I think it's a colossal disaster. The basic facts is that under the Broadcasting Act, which is a very thoroughly regulatory institution, there's about 4,500 to 5,000 entities that are regulated, and they owe their being to a federal licensing authority. And, the older Broadcasting Act had more objectives to be achieved by broadcasting than there were letters in the alphabet. I am not kidding. And it was highly regulated, and it was premised on very few licensees talking to very many people. And there was a case for a significant level of government intervention and control over the assumed power of the few voices talking to the many, the 3 talking to millions, the 5 talking to millions. And but that was a broadcasting model. It was a 20th century invention. It's relatively modern idea. The older idea was that of printing, which after a few revolutions and a couple of beheadings of monarchs, it turned into a view that you didn't have to have a prior permission of the state in order to print.
Right.
And up until now, in Canada, as in elsewhere in the world, you clack away on your keyboard or you talk like we are talking, and we're not doing so under government authority. No, we're responsible for what we say,
right,
but we don't have prior permission. So when you publish a book, there's not a stamp coming from either the office of the Holy Inquisition or from the CRTC saying, nothing prevents this book from being published, right? And we're going back to 18th century Portugal, 15th century Spain. We're having a stamp of approval on what is tweeted, what is or the platform or the content themselves. And this is utterly reactionary. It is implicitly totalitarian, and I defy anyone to argue against it for those other than those terms.
Those are the words that come to mind. I mean, and the government has been intent on this. They tried desperately to get a Bill C-10, which was going to monitor, was going to control free speech or speech generated by users, my tweets, my podcasts, whatever that may be.
Yes.
They then broke and had an election, so that legislation disappeared. They were reelected and they came back with a vengeance, despite the fact that they had been consulting through that time that the election was on and later, and many people were saying to them what you're saying, which is you can't do this. You can't take an old 20th century model that you imposed on TV channels and TV networks and slap it on the internet and everybody who uses it. It doesn't fit. It's not the right thing, even if you want to do that. And furthermore, doing that, controlling speech, is also not a good thing.
Well, there's several points of objection to what is up. First of all, the CRTC has neither the competence nor the capacity, and no group of human beings, however wise, would have that capacity. It is not because the CRTC is defective; it's because no human institution really should be in that business. The second thing is when you come to this sort of, apart from the practical questions, you have long-term cultural issues that are at stake. And by that I mean is that freedom of speech is the freedom which really guarantees all the other rights.
Yeah.
And you don't really know what you think until you speak it, till you utter it. It may be uttered in print, it may be uttered in video. You may have a rant with the TV camera in your computer. You may, this is just normal that people don't know what they think until they have the ability to write it. And the idea that we should all be writing or speaking or making videos with the heavy, intrusive, pervasive feeling of angst coming from, oh my God, will my license be pulled, or will YouTube cancel me, or my monetary model be wrecked because of what I say, is exactly the kind of pervasive fear that regimes of this sort want. And I come back to it is a great deal of our problem, everybody's problem in looking at some of these bills, is just saying, I can't believe what I'm reading. I cannot believe what I'm reading. It's like reading, I don't know, to make only a significant, but not a significant exaggeration, but it's like reading, Hitler's Empowering Act. Hereafter, all the government may rule by order in council. Thank you very much. You're dismissed. Yeah. Yeah. And so there's very problematic, to use a modern term, elements to C11, which is the inheritor of C10, and various of the other statutes. They're poorly crafted.
Yeah, they're definitely poorly crafted. The other concern that comes up with those that you've listed is that, the minister says, oh, we're not going, don't worry, we're not coming after user-generated content. You write your emails, you send out your tweets. We have other ministers for whom, in one case of Minister Guilbeault, whose perhaps English was not his first language, but blurted out things like, we don't want criticism of the government. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen. I mean, when you start to hear those things, everything gets very, very troubling. Then you hear from the CRTC, that's supposed to be the regulatory body, that, oh no, they're not going to regulate the internet. They're going to force the service providers,
Yes. Well, that's like you're saying everybody will now speak with the same freedom of speech as you have putting in a letter to the editor.
Yeah.
The letter to the editor becomes the model whereby they will craft, they bear the responsibility for what is printed, and you will conform to their spacing and other requirements, their algorithm, so to speak. And,
yes, the old-fashioned algorithm,
Yeah, so you don't escape control by delegating governmental control to large platforms. It's just relocates it and makes it less accountable.
Right. You have written about this because I keep coming back to the same question, and I do this as a senator that sits in front of committees studying this legislation, that I find extremely troubling when we have mixed messages, but clearly the one that comes through is, we want to regulate content on the internet and we're going to do it and you can't stop us. But I always keep coming back, which is the obvious reason of why government wants to do this, is because they don't want criticism of themselves. They want to have some say over how the debate is carried on in this country. And I guess any government that gets elected wants to stay elected and will use the tools. But you've written about these so-called guiding principles that kind of started this ball rolling for them.
Well, I'm not entirely sure to what you refer, but I will say this, that in the last few years, we've seen two very large issues upon which government is claiming strong interventionist authority: the global warming, climate change debate, and the COVID, each of which have involved compulsory measures And the justification, the felt justification by governments to save the planet on these kinds of matters, about which far fewer people are in accord than they might like. And as the coercive steps, take, for example, the Dutch farmers, as the coercive steps get stronger and more obvious, many in government, I think, fear the self-organizing power of people to oppose. And as they seek to gain more power over us in terms of lockdowns, masks, compulsory vaccinations, et cetera, about which there is a very large and legitimate controversy, they seek to, they can be, I'll be polite about it. One can infer they seek to control debate about this to a much greater extent, because it only takes a few heretics at the beginning to start what I might call, say, vaccine hesitancy or global warming skepticism of any kind. And when you have fanatics like Stephen Guilbeault and others, they're not interested in tolerating in any sense an actual debate about these matters. The science is settled. The science is settled. The science is settled. And we're in a stage of very acute social and ideological contestation, such as we haven't been since, I don't know, the late 60s, early 70s. Right now, the forces of authoritarianism are firmly on the side of the political left and firmly on the side of telling you what you should be thinking and saying and feeling. If not, you're either a racist, a deplorable, a this or a that.
Yeah.
So there's a good deal of this going around, and I think C11 is its natural extension.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a good example, which is the Dutch farmers, and we saw them literally rallying in the street to protest a government policy that was going to put not only them out of business, but food sources for the world at risk. And, that's the same thing we see here, whether it's livelihoods from the energy sector or the impact of everything from carbon taxes to restrictions on the use of fertilizer, or whether we're going to put labels on farm produced food saying it's unhealthy and unsafe for you. And I think people do have to have a mechanism between elections to express their views on that, provided they are within the law. You can't have hate speech, and you can't have, racism in your speech and all of those things. But short of that, we have to be able to have that discussion as a nation, as a population of a given nation.
Entirely, we have to be able to have that discussion, and it won't always be pretty. It won't always be balanced. It won't always be fair. But and if people are fanatically committed to certain positions, opposition to those positions will seem like coming from barbaric yops rather than civil discourse. And people in the controversy business, much more than you or I, such as Jordan Peterson and others, are fully subject to a great deal of scrutiny for what they say. But we'll all come under that. We can all come under that kind of scrutiny, and we can all be canceled. And sorry, ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking, whatever anybody thinks of Donald Trump, to be able to silence a president of the United States on Twitter or cut him off does mean it's possible for any of us to be silenced in that way.
The technological means is at hand.
Yeah.
And that has always far more to do with how things turn out than discussion of rights and responsibilities. If I can do it and it's easily done in a cost-effective way, then censors will censor. And I think this is where we're at. They would like legal justification for it, or they would like to have legal justification for them to lean on the platforms to do it for them. But I think the real thing is this centralization of control over discourse is quite strong, and I think they intend to use it.
When you were writing about the guiding principles in the Heritage Department, which is the government department that has the lead on this,
Yes.
it comes from their desire to achieve diversity, equity, inclusion, all of the
Yes.
words that we hear from this, but it goes so much further than that. And there are two other bills I want to come back and talk
Sure.
to, the online harms bill, but also C-18, which is about forcing anybody who links to content and puts that on a online will be subject to payment requirements to pay the existing mainstream
Yes.
legacy media for that. It's all complicated, which is why I think people have a hard time getting their arms around this. But if we can just stay on C11 for a moment, because you've got the CRTC experience, it is not clear to me, even in these attempts to do it, and you've mentioned this, the CRTC does not have either the expertise or the ability, the size, the number of people, the technology to monitor the billions of exchanges that go on every day. So that means they're going to have to target.
Well, they can target. They can put out general regulations for 22-year-old clerks in Google to interpret, or it really, they work by getting the platforms to do the dirty work for them, right, with unappealable bans or suspensions, or you have indicated distrust of government figures on COVID deaths, right, wrong. So they, how should I put it? I believe there is work that, even if it could be done, should not be done.
Yes. Okay.
And the attempts to make the world woke are, first of all, going to generate and are in the process of generating a reaction to it.
Yeah.
But the idea that the simplest and biggest stupid idea in the world, currently dominant, is that unequal results are the sign of racism. It's that stupid. And any unequal result, however statistically engineered, how perceived, is the result of basically not just racism, but white racism. Is sociological twaddle, but it pervades everything. It is a gigantic stupid idea, because to face the contrary is that people are as unequal as they are equal. People are unequal in vastly important ways. People are equal in hugely fundamental ways.
Right.
And we deal in society with the conflicts between equality and inequality. Jordan Peterson is a vastly more accomplished public speaker and money earner than I am. Do I have equal time and equal rights to equal time with Jordan Peterson? I think not. And I don't. A great deal of this equality business is simply the mobilization of envy for the purposes of social disruption. But I think that at the core of the big stupid ideas that are marching through society and overturning universities and wrecking institutions is the belief that there can be no unequal outcome but for racism, and particularly white racism.
Yes, and
so
you're
groups
thinking
get a pass.
That's what's underlying a lot of this. I mean, when you talk about this, the intent on controlling the discussion that goes on to ensure that we achieve diversity and equity and inclusion. It seems, any government could be committed to those kinds of ideals and goals, but to try and find very particular ways by controlling speech to accomplish that, there's lots of things governments can do. They can, reorder and disperse funds, money generated by our
They can
society.
spend, they can plan, they can
Right.
build, and they can legislate, but they
Right.
can't really necessarily do that much.
Yeah. But controlling speech seems to me not to be helping any of those particular issues if they're dead serious about that.
Well,
This is the last tool you'd use.
Well, of course, Pamela, you don't have the mind of a commissar. The first thing you must control is speech so that people will professionally and in any other way not be able to notice publicly.
Yeah.
They will not be able to notice things. They'll not be able to observe things. If observed, it will be kept in themselves. There'll be a public face and there'll be a private face.
Yeah.
It'll be complete freedom of discussion as long as you're away from the microphones within people you've known and trusted for 20 years and not more than 2 people or 3 people in the conversation. Then there'll be freedom of speech. Everywhere else, the iron mask will go on. And that is the point. The point is social control. The point is not freedom of speech. The point is obedience to a view of things in which the only possible explanation for inequality is racism. Mm-hmm. And this, in one of the least racially concerned societies in the world, Canada, with the most profound dedication to equality of rights, is somehow made to feel bad for its existence. And this is the game that our government is playing with us. You just have to see the policies on, or the talk and language around residential schools, which is another good 19th century idea that went totally bad. In other words, another crime of good intentions. And everywhere you see it, it's like the only possible explanation for the evils of the world is white racism. End of story. There's no other explanation is possible. And then you impose an idea of society in this way, and everybody shuts up, obeys. And the Soviet Union, it lasted for 70 years. There's no reason it won't last many decades if successful.
This is, obviously, what you're saying is genuinely frightening. The other companion bills here. Now, we haven't seen all of the details of the new version, but the online harms bill also feeds into that, although we already have rules about hate speech and about liability. You can't go on and say, I think this person committed murder without any evidence. We have courts of law for all of that kind of thing. We have hate speech laws so that you can't attack people based on their creed or color or those kinds of issues. Why is it the same principle behind that one in your mind?
Well, the legislation, when it was first introduced, it's been withdrawn and for reconsideration.
Yeah, was
predicated on the notion that I think there was about 6 kinds of groups that were, in a sense, permanently less powerful and therefore permanently offended. And so, and representatives in that group would be making rules for what would be said or how the act was to be interpreted. Forgive my looseness, so it's been a long time since I looked at it. But it was basically terribly woke in the sense that only certain people lack power. Those that lack power are in a position of vulnerability. They need special protection. And this bill was intended to give them special protection. And this was to be forever. In other words, the legal framework would be that everybody who fell into those categories would be forever in those categories. In other words, less powerful than presumably white cisgendered males or something of this nature. You can fill in the blanks. You can fill in the blanks with this stuff anytime. And so that was there. So that was how it was originally crafted. It's now in a process of consultation among
affected groups,
and we'll see how that goes. The C-18, on the other hand, which is the shakedown of the large Meta and probably Google for the use of hyperlinks is another. Well, it's unclear as to who is covered. It's unclear as to what the CRTC should do about it, and it's unclear about how the payers or the designated businesses are to be make the payments, and what these apparently private arrangements between the platforms and the journalistic organizations are to be worked out.
We all know that legacy media is just that. In many cases, they simply didn't respond to the new technology fast enough or with the right kind of equipment, and so they were getting left behind in the money-making part of their business, because fewer people were reading them or watching them because they had these other online sources to turn to. But a part of that exchange of ideas and battles and rethinking things is, you and I are having a conversation, and I want to say to you, why don't you read this piece that was in the newspaper? Or why don't you take a look at this piece that was on the news, and I'll send you a link to that. Even you and I can do that now. If they impose that on the platforms, then the result of that is we're all going to have access to less information, and that will restrict our ability to exchange it with one another as a way to have a conversation.
Well, yes, I'm concerned about any kinds of payments for hyperlinks, and accepting as the Internet Society in particular as a kind of position I know will be against payments for hyperlinks, because the whole idea of the internet was free link up.
Right.
The statute itself, C-18, presumes to create an economic value when the economic value runs the other way. I mean, Peter Menzies will say that the economic value runs from the newspaper organization benefiting from the link, not the large platform benefiting from the link. But anyway, having thus by fiat created an economic value in the link, it then says there must now be negotiations between a designated class of news organizations, which is the usual, watch the definitions, go there, and then a designated class of platforms, with the CRTC in a rather ambiguous situation of seemingly having to approve them without much authority to change their the contents of these private agreements. So it's unlike the Australians have not implemented their act. They simply put it into place and then said the minister may designate an organization that will be owing these payments.
Yeah.
And so they didn't enact the legislation. They didn't put it into force. They corralled the parties into private negotiations and got the job done. So there's some concerns we have about how the legislation is drafted, but the most compelling concern is the internet wants to be free, and the net result of a great deal of this will be a growth in the virtual private networks, so that'll escape local control.
I guess what really always troubles me, and maybe it's my years in the world of journalism, but there is also not a real response, with a couple of exceptions, one of which we'll talk about, to the erosion of free speech, to limits on our ability to do that. I mean, it's such an underlying principle for journalism that you just can't overstate it. At least journalism is practiced in the last century when I did so. But we see cases. There was a recent one where the CRTC was asked to rule on this, where on Radio-Canada, the French version of CBC, the N-word was used in a discussion, or was part of a discussion.
It was the title of the book, Les Nègres Blancs d'Amérique, which is Pierre Valliere. It was the separatist and anti-English and anti-capitalist tract and excoriating the French Canadians for their passivity in the face of all this capitalist aggression against them.
So that discussion, and we've seen that happen on the English side of CBC too, where if you're reading the title of a book, certainly it shouldn't be an issue. Anyway, that came up, went to the CRTC, and the CRTC says you shouldn't say that. And then everybody went, oh my God, you're restricting free speech. We're not in favor of restricting free speech. When in fact, it's the same group of people, in large measure, certainly Quebec ministers, who have been on the other side of this issue, are the ones putting forward this legislation.
Well, this illustrates Denton's first law of human behavior, which is there's no limit to human hypocrisy, including my own. But the point being made is that the elites of French Canada, who had been largely, especially in the media, beating the drum that opposition to C10 as it then was, or C11, was just a bunch of Anglo bigots envious or jealous of subsidies to French TV, suddenly realized, oh, the censorship can apply to us. That was the first shock. But that's
revelation.
Just normal human behaviors. Oh, I didn't know this stuff applied to us.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that went on was that only 2 commissioners of the CRTC brought up the issue that there's such a thing as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that this provision was against, this decision was against and did not properly consider our rights to free speech.
Yeah.
So again,
they're in the chart. I mean, presumably that should be underlying in the basis for decisions made by government appointed bodies like the CRTC.
One would think.
So do you think that's going to change it? Because certainly the government is using Canadian content, and specifically Quebec content, French language content, and French cultural content as a frame for this discussion. We want to make sure in this global enterprise called the internet that Canadian content is discoverable and findable and accessible, which I think it already is. But anyway, they're using that as I don't know, it seems like kind of a 1960s thing in my head, but people will go and find the content they like and choose, and there's a way to do it by simply typing it in.
Hello, the internet has been invented and everything has changed. I mean, all of this stuff is an attempt to force legacy media models onto the internet rather than force the internet onto legacy media models.
Yeah.
And so I used to joke in the CRTC that it was the Society for the Preservation of Semi-Obsolescent Industry. And it's like no joke goes unturned. It's like, it is. And so what they're trying to do is to preserve old business models through subsidy contraptions. And look, I'm not of a generation that does it, but there was all kinds of young people, YouTubers and people who were making money off the internet who were saying TikTokers, this stuff is against our interests. They make content. They don't need a license. They don't have permission. They make money off it. They're incredibly in tune with their stats, and they sell it to the world because the internet is by definition a global network addressing system, which has points of contact everywhere in the world without regard to national or other boundaries. And so the internet only knows IP addresses and autonomous system numbers. It doesn't know boundaries. It doesn't know nations. It doesn't know the claptrap of nationalism. So when you try to impose this crazy notion that the internet should be made to conform to 1980s Canadian broadcasting, and that the internet is nothing more than a gigantic cable system which needs to be harnessed. That's a wonderful CRTC world. Harnessed, like the 2 horses of pulling the
buggy
cart.
Yes.
And they actually think this. This is the trouble. You're seeing all these young entrepreneurs, and they're building a business.
using these platforms just as anybody who starts a corner store or a hot dog stand, right? They're just using a different technology to do it. This is,
and they didn't seek permission of the CRTC. There weren't hearings.
Right.
There weren't, there weren't hearings and processes and wise political appointees doing their best and correcting over legal documents. They just go and do it.
Yeah, they just
which is how it should be.
One final point on this before I let you go, and thank you so much again for
always a delight to talk to you, especially
thoughtful material you do on this. But the rest of the world must be looking at this and saying, what are you people thinking that you're going to try and control the internet and make sure there's enough Canadian content? Like, are there other parts of the world just going, what?
Oh, I think Canada is becoming a laughing stock in every possible way of PC woke. It goes through this for periodically. Canada is held as an object lesson in how not to formulate internet policy. It's just how not to do it. Oh, let's impose a broadcasting model. That'll really work. And the more desperate they get about the advances of technology and the changes of how business is done, the more crazy they seem. But Canada is a leader in backward-looking technology policy, and here we are.
Says the former, national commissioner of the CRTC, who actually knows whereof he speaks on these issues. That you
sometimes.
Sometimes. Well, thank you for this, Timothy. It's just really good. I mean, a lawyer who works on telecom issues, an advisor. You also have your company, Windermere, that does this. And as chair of the Internet Society, I know you are one of the groups that attempts to intervene, not only domestically, but internationally on these things, to say, give your head a shake.
Intervening with this government on C11 was a lesson in, people will not understand what they are paid not to understand.
Yeah.
And trying to talk to the government people on this was just hopeless.
They had their policy directions set, and when people like you come in and say, no, you can't do it that way, then we don't want to hear from you. Like a lot of the submissions that people made looking at these kinds of legislation were not even made public at the time. Individual.
Yeah. And it was the suppression of content was but anyway, those who will not see, and none so blind as those who will not see. And I think it's a choice on their part not to see the internet and not to understand it. And a confrontation with reality will ensue.
Well, we're going to keep having conversations as long as we're allowed to.
And even after that.
And maybe even after that. Tim Denton, thanks so much. I know we'll talk again soon.
Pamela, lovely to talk. Bye-bye now.
Great. That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We will talk again soon. Bye-bye for now.